Welcome to the Envirowatch NL podcast with me, Robert Loder.
And with me, Glenn Wheeler. And this week, we're talking about the end of the Newfoundland cod moratorium, as recently announced by the federal Liberal MPs from the province. But if they hope to score some political points, they've been badly mistaken. The announcement has been widely condemned, not only because cod stocks have yet to fully recover from what they were when the cod fishery was shut down in 1992, leading to the biggest layoff in Canadian history, 40,000 people. But because some of the new quota will go to offshore trawlers, the very people blamed for the overfishing that caused the problem in the first place. Among the voices condemning the federal announcement is the Fisheries Union, the FFAW, and we welcome as our guest this week Abe Solberg, fishery scientist at the FFAW. And Abe, great to have you on the program.
Thanks so much for having me on, guys.
Abe, let's start with the status quo. We've had an inshore fishery for many years, a stewardship fishery, and the FFAW represents those inshore fisheries. Tell us a little bit about the inshore fishery, the boats, catches, and so on.
Yeah, thanks. So as far as cod goes, like you said, Glenn, at the beginning, there's been a moratorium on the stock from a commercial harvest since 1992 after DFO announced that stock collapsed. But since 2005, there's been a stewardship fishery, which is basically it's a small allocation for inshore vessels, which are less than 65 feet, to catch a certain amount of cod each year, depending on what that actual quota is. So folks have, there's a total quota, and then every individual has a share that they can go and harvest within the year in order to reach up to that quota. And that's been going on since 2005.
So, Abe, it's great that you're a fishery scientist as well as being among the leadership at the FFAW here, because the science here is kind of interesting and alarming. The cod stocks have recovered somewhat from what they were in when the fishery was shut down, but they're hardly back in the to what they were in the good old days. Catches now are about a tenth of what they were back then. So tell us from a scientific point of view where we are in terms of the recovery of the cod fishery.
Yeah, that's a really good question. So this year, I guess to preface that, the reason that they've opened up a commercial fishery this year rather than keeping it as a stewardship fishery is nominally because the stock is now out of what's called the critical zone. So DFO manages their fish stocks through the precautionary approach with three different zones. They have the critical zone, the cautious zone, and the healthy zone. And that critical zone is basically the point of no return. It's where the stock is at a point where any prolonged fishing activity on it could really result in irreparable harm to the stock. So this year, they actually changed that reference point of defining where the critical zone was, and they dropped that down. So previously, they were looking at a much higher reference point, and they were saying, well, this is the critical zone up to this point. But they updated the stock assessment model, basically using data from the 50s all the way back and incorporating a stock recruitment relationship, which allowed them to see that actually, the stock where it is today is pretty similar to where it was in the 70s. And following the 70s, we had, we were obviously fishing much heavier, but we also saw, big increases in the stock size after the 70s. So they were able to say, with the benefit of hindsight, this stock isn't actually in as dire a position as we thought it was. That said, it's nowhere near where it was in the 80s. But through that hindsight, they were able to redefine the critical zone and say, all right, well, we know that actually the point of no return is lower than where we're to now. This is probably in the cautious zone now. So after bringing the stock out of the critical zone, they brought it into the cautious zone, and that was what they used to open up this commercial fishery. But like you said, we're nowhere near where it used to be in the 80s.
Right. So they're changing the goalposts in a way. They're changing the yardsticks of, to bring it from one category to another. So, the biggest change is probably be in the goalposts rather than in the actual fish recovery to some extent. That's the big change is the change in their guidelines rather than recovery of codfish.
So that's exactly right. Basically, they've the size of the stock hasn't changed at all, but where we position it relative to historic trends is different now because we're able to use, that back data to see that it's actually not as bad as what DFO Science had previously thought it was before they had incorporated those data from the 50s, 60s, and 70s to see where it is. Like I'm a big cyclist. I like to bike, right? And when you're going up a hill the first time, you think, oh my God, this will never end. But after you've done it once and you're, on the hill, you realize where exactly you are in it. And that's effectively what the stock assessment model did. So by going back further, we're able to see the stock isn't in as terrible a shape. It can sustain a bit more fishing pressure. It is, again, nowhere near where it used to be.
And just one more question before
Yeah.
Robert chimes in here. While this is going on, we have concerns about capelin, and we know that cod is the biggest predator of capelin. In other words, that's a big food source of cod, and we still have a commercial capelin fishery. Do you, as a scientist or the FFAW, do you have a position on the wisdom of maintaining the capelin fishery as is and not answering the call from groups like Oceana, the environmental group that says there should be no commercial capelin fishery?
Yeah, so we obviously know that capelin and cod have a very symbiotic relationship, right? There's been a lot of research done to show the importance of the capelin stock on cod health, etc. The things we don't know really are what is the impact of the commercial fishery on capelin stock, right? That's one of the questions that DFO Science actually doesn't have an answer to. It's unclear how much fishing pressure is impacting that stock and impacting the resources or the food availability for cod, right? When capelin come in, that's fishing is predominantly happening on the spawning stock. As it comes in, it's unclear exactly what that recruitment relationship is or how much is being taken out of the water that would die otherwise. So the extent that commercial fishing is impacting capelin, which is impacting cod, is a really difficult thing to answer. I think the other element of it that we often so a lot of like Oceana and those groups they'll point to, in Alaska, for instance, you can't harvest forage fish, and in Iceland and in Norway they have limit reference points for their capelin that are pretty well tied to is there enough capelin in the water for cod, and that's actually what the capelin reference point is here as well. They say so the capelin reference point in Newfoundland is, or at least in the northern cod stock, the 2J3KL. Same for capelin is tied to cod. So is there enough capelin in the water for cod? And DFO Science is saying that yes, right now there is, because we have the cod that's in the cautious zone. So by default, there must be enough capelin in there to maintain that level of stock health. But anyways, when you look at like tying those two reference points together, it's it's FFAW's position, and it's my belief as well that diversified fisheries are really more sustainable overall. The more different species you can harvest, the less over-reliance you have on one or the other, which can lead to overfishing. If you're able to sort of diversify those activities, you have a more sustainable fishery in general, and that's important for the health of all of our species, right? And then we just don't know what the impact of the commercial fishery is on capelin health. The other thing that I like to say is, capelin are what you're talking about in essence is I don't want to say resource allocation decision, but that's basically what it is. Like, there's no one on the west coast of the island who would say we need to keep enough shrimp in the water to feed redfish, right? Because redfish isn't really that important of a species. So what we're doing is we're making value propositions about the benefit of both. So if we're going to have that discussion, it really needs to be a much more thorough discussion than what DFO would do and say, well, we need enough capelin for cod necessarily, without talking to all the fleets and all the stakeholders, because is that the ecosystem that we're actually trying to achieve? These things have trade-offs, right? Like just, so maximum sustainable yield is the term in fishery science, but keeping the stock basically at its most productive point. And it's really well established that we can't have every single stock at its current maximum sustainable yield. There is a trade-off between those two. So if we're going to be looking at decisions like that, as far as, how capelin and cod interact, those are really much broader decisions than one specific for science, because they have a lot of policy and social economic stuff involved, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm. Robert.
So we just spoke about the food supply for the cod, but what about the other species that use the cod as their food supply, such as the seal population in our oceans, which is known to be a large population at this time? How does that compare with the numbers that they're comparing to from the 70s and 80s?
Yeah, so my understanding is that the seal population is really much, much higher than it has been historically observed. And one of the problems that we also have right now is we don't have a great sense of how many seals there actually are and where they are, right? As the climate has continued to change and waters have warmed and ice has different timing now. Where we do the seal surveys, those aerial surveys predominantly how they're done, it's reasonable to think that as there's been, different migration shifts and different changes, we would expect to see seals in different places, but those surveys are still taking place at the same locations. So how well are we able to actually track those seal stocks and what their impact might be is a real question right now. And redefining some of those baselines is really, really important. Also, right now they don't have a good sense of how much seals are actually eating, how much they're taking out of the water. And some of the ways that they actually eat. Are they eating the whole fish or are they eating parts of the fish? Because that would change. Then you'd have mortality on two fish when the weight that's being eaten it would not be equivalent to that, right? So that's some of the other questions that are there. But as the seal stock has skyrocketed, we would assume that mortality on cod would likewise skyrocket.
Okay, so I'll go back to the question I was supposed to ask here now. So the question I was supposed to ask is, so why do you think the federal government made this announcement right now? There's been no pressure from FAW or provincial government. So where did this come from? Just out of the blue?
It is a question I have been asking myself all the time, and I'm going to take off my science hat here and try to think. I don't know, because in a lot of these decisions and a lot of what the federal government has been messaging, they've been saying, well, this isn't a political decision. Obviously, this wasn't a political decision. It made no one happy. A political decision usually gives a bone to someone. And this one, I suppose it did. It gave it to a couple of offshore companies, right? It gave it to OCI and a few other of those large conglomerates, but no one else. And if you were making a decision, particularly in light of an election, you would think you'd try to appeal to the thousands of fish harvesters rather than the couple of CEOs. So why they did this, I cannot say. My best sense is that they decided once the stock is out of the critical zone, they're going to move it to the cautious zone. And if it's in the cautious zone, we can have a commercial fishery, so we cannot keep it as a stewardship fishery. That is just patently untrue. There's one stewardship fishery in the country, and it's the northern cod stock. They can do whatever they want with it. It is their own rules for it. So obviously, if it was in the cautious zone, they could have kept it as a stewardship fishery. Through the stewardship fishery, the stock has grown by almost 500,000 tons. You can continue that inshore harvest and have a stock that continues to grow by opening up to the offshore. It's, I'm sure we'll get into it, but the environmental effects of that and the possible effects on the stock are enormous, like so much more than just the additional quota. The way they can target fish, the likelihood of overfishing, that all increases exponentially when you have higher capacity vessels like those big trawlers coming in and swooping up as many cod as they can.
Now let's talk about the offshore fleet there. Was the government required to give 10% access to the offshore fleet automatically as part of our obligations in the North Atlantic Fisheries Organization? Because that's kind of like the explanation we got. We had no choice but to let these in because that's just the deal we have with these other countries.
So
was that required?
5% is required to go to international vessels as part of the North Atlantic Fisheries Organization, right? As part of NAFO, 5% of those stocks do go to international in the same way that Canada gets to fish internationally or gets to fish in Norway 5% of certain quotas, right? So as part of NAFO, by opening up to the commercial, yes, that is a requirement as being a part of that organization. As far as giving 6% to the offshore Canadian offshore, no, that's not a requirement at all, right? They could have given it all to the inshore. They chose to give that additional. So about 11% of that quota has gone now to offshore vessels. 5% of it is being in NAFO was required, but the other percent was not required. And frankly, if you kept it a stewardship fishery, none of it would have been required. This whole headache could have been avoided had they said, what we're doing right now is working. We know the stock is nowhere near where it used to be. We can continue to nurse this fishery up, and we can continue to keep it as a stewardship fishery, even with a higher total allowable catch. And they just failed to do that for reasons that, again, I truly cannot explain.
And what do you think is going to happen now? We have another political spat between the provincial Liberals and the federal Liberals. You have Andrew Furey. First, he was talking about the carbon tax, and now he's on about the offshore fleet. So another another wedge between the federal and provincial Liberals. And of course, you have many unhappy inshore fishers. It kind of reminds you of the protest about the crab fishery a couple months ago. So, from the FFAW perspective, from your members' perspective, what now? More protests? You think the government is going to change its mind? Where to from here?
Yeah, I mean, right now, so the union has put out a petition that we're asking members of the public to sign, as well as harvesters, to bring that to the floor to keep this as a stewardship fishery, keep it with the inshore. I mean, this is speaking, from my perspective at the union, but also my personal perspective. This is a slap in the face to inshore harvesters. It's a slap in the face to plant workers. It's a slap in the face to the people of rural Newfoundland and Labrador, right? So many of these towns rely on the fishery. And by taking this quota, giving it to these companies, they don't bring that back, right? Those offshore vessels, that's not fish that's being processed in these communities. It's going away. And it is an affront to everyone here who has spent the last 32 years trying to rebuild the stock to get it to a point where there could be a greater harvest. So it's going to be public pressure. It's so disappointing to see so many of our federal MPs, celebrating this decision and saying, "Oh, well, the union can't have its cake and eat it too," not realizing how, detrimental this is to these communities. And opening to the offshore, it really does jeopardize the future health of the stock. These are massive vessels that can come in and just sweep up fish in an enormous magnitude, right? Like prior to the stock collapse in the 80s, I think it was 1986, the Inshore Fishermen's Association commissioned a report to look at catch rates and declining catch rates in the inshore. And they were telling Department of Fisheries and Oceans, there was Air Fisheries and Oceans, they said, we're seeing these lower catch rates. There's something wrong with the stock. And the offshore fleets, these big vessels, were saying, "Oh, we're not seeing any problem. We're catching them the same as we always did." And the reason for that is what is now known, and this was a term coined after that collapse, as hyperstability or hyperaggregation. That when a fleet is in bad, or a stock's in bad health, those fish will aggregate and they'll get into a smaller spatial range. And so for a large trawler who has the ability to target the stock, they can come in and they can split those fish up super easy. They're not going to notice any change in their catch rates. Whereas inshore harvesters, 6 years before the collapse, were saying there is a real problem here that we need to do something about. And what we've done now is that same fleet that caused that problem is allowed back in. And if we start seeing, inshore harvesters start seeing lower catch rates, well, they can just come in and sweep it up. I mean, imagine how much that technical capacity has increased over the last 30 years, right? You have better ability to target, you have bigger nets, you have more storage capacity. All this stuff makes a difference. It is, not only are you taking the resource away from the people of Newfoundland, but you're also jeopardizing it immensely in a way that the stewardship fishery never, ever could.
Mm-hmm.
Wow.
Well, Abe, it's great to hear from you on that. I know, Robert, in your area, you have you have people who depend on the cod fishery, the stewardship fishery, also the recreational cod fishery is part of Newfoundland culture, tradition.
I just like to say, Glenn, I'm old enough to remember ice fishing for cod in front of my father's cabin as a kid. So that was not yesterday, we'll say, but I'd love to be able to do that again in the future. And what looks like with these commercial fisheries is not going to happen that way.
Kind of reopens the trauma of 1992 in a way. It's kind of like it's re-triggering, I think, the trauma from those times.
Mm-hmm. And I can still remember the announcement on TV as a child.